It's a pleasure to be here with everyone this morning. My name is Alex Major. I am an attorney. Hold your applause. I focus on the area of government contracts. But where I kind of tend to focus is in the cybersecurity space. I've been doing it for almost over a decade, helping contractors and those who sell to the federal government try to remain as compliant as they can with the ever-shifting laws and regulations related to cybersecurity. I always like to say I was not raised a lawyer. I'm a retired Air Force intelligence officer. Actually, just realized this morning I worked with Tiffany back in a while ago, shall we say. So it's my pleasure to be here, and I'll let the panel introduce themselves as well as I moderate.
Thank you, Alex. My name is Lauren Clark. So I work for Thomson Reuters within their corporate function supporting all of our business units. Been there for about 6 years. I've built ops capabilities, and I lead their strategy and business enablement function.
I'm Sean Stalzer. I'm with Dominion Energy. My same bad joke I use all the time is the lights are still on, so my guys are doing good. We run cybersecurity for the energy across 16 states, so 1 in 10 Americans get power of some sort from us. I'm based out of Richmond here in Virginia.
I'm Jon Check. I lead a Raytheon Cyber Defense, Cyber Protection Solutions team until next Friday when our business unit is being divested. And so there'll be a new name for the business area I'm a part of next week.
Hey there, my name is Neel Sata. I am a co-founder and the GM of cybersecurity for a company called Imaginex Digital. I started it about 8 years ago with a couple of folks from Accenture. Half of our business is cybersecurity. The other half is software engineering and cloud-based work.
Excellent. So what we have put together here today is kind of hopefully you'll see that we've got a pretty broad brush when we're talking about cybersecurity. And when we sat down to start talking about it, the thing that we initially brought up, which I really appreciated, is we kind of talked about it earlier this morning as well, is that there's really kind of two sides of cybersecurity. There's the human side and there's the technical side. And I think we're going to break that down today a little bit more in depth. But on the human side, I guess one of the big things that we're interacting with or having to deal with is how do you maintain awareness, knowledge, education, so that maybe you aren't swayed by social media, or at least you know to recognize. And so, and we were talking earlier about trust in relation to deliverables. But I want to talk about first of all, I thought training and education. What have you seen? Lauren, we'll start with you on ways people are training or the ways that you train that you find effective to educate, and we'll just say employees.
Sure. So for context, I've never worked at a small company, so I think that matters in terms of the answer that I'm given. So TR right now is 25,000 people. I've worked at GE before. So I think there's one thing of baseline training that ultimately all employees have to be accountable for, and knowing what that is and knowing how it's disseminated or rolled out or people take. And I think that's pretty baseline. I don't think that's new or novel. You may have your own ways of doing it. What I think really comes into play is what do you do above and beyond that, where you think there's risk or awareness or something tailored to the roles that you have within your company and what you do. My response to that is probably very different than Sean's when he talks about Dominion Energy and specific roles. Thomson Reuters, we develop software solutions. So thinking about within your company what roles that you have and what tailored training makes sense and what you can scale with too. You have to keep in mind what you can scale with and how you deliver it. So prioritizing based on risk and based on where you have groups of people that do specific type of work, and tailor the education. That's what I found to be the most meaningful, is if it's not tailored for a role, if you're going above and beyond, it doesn't resonate. And it depends on your audience. If you want to train a developer and there's nothing technical about your training and you don't have a hands-on place for them to learn, it might not really sink in the way you want it to. So what I've seen, Alex, is baseline for everybody that's mandatory, the things that are non-negotiable, and then prioritized in parts of the organization based on where we think there's risk or where we think somebody needs to know something unique for their day-to-day jobs in order to make the right decisions for the company, because we all play a role. Informing people on how they need to think about it in their role, though, can't do it for 25,000 people. but I most definitely can do it where we think there's risk, and that's a prioritization conversation. And like I said, scale too. So figuring out where you have risk, figuring out the best way, tailoring it for the audience, I think is important.
Sean, you have a unique perspective here.
Sure. So we started like everybody. We have death by PowerPoint, right? And everybody hates it. Nobody pays attention. So we evolved from that. We said, we're going to get real smart here. We're going to go video-based, and we're going to do our own videos, and we're going to go out to power plants, and we're going to have workers. And that was great. We could measure and improve response there. But it's still terrible when it comes to things like phishing and stuff like that. So we pivoted one further mode, which is I go talk to everybody. So all 25,000 Dominion folks have heard from me personally. Now, maybe not one-on-one. Maybe it's in a room like this. Maybe it's on a Teams meeting. And we do a threat briefing for them. And we do tailor it. We customize it for the risk in their area, for the job function that they're doing. And I kind of walk through hey, you know we're the power company, the Pentagon, right? You know that 85% of all electrons on the internet flow through Loudoun County, right? That's kind of important to the world when China invades Taiwan. And we kind of walk through that process with them. And then I go, hey, here's your data on the dark web. So I take everybody that's on the meeting invite, and I look up their passwords on the dark web, and I put them up on the wall. That gets their attention. Now there's something in it for them. And then we kind of walk them through the world of today, right? Here's the problem out there in the world. Here's where you fit into it. Here's what you need to do personally to protect your bank account, your kids, your life. And then I ask them for some things. Here at the Dominion side, here's my 3 or 4 takeaways I really need you to focus on while you're here as it relates to your job, risk-based function for you. Please give that back to us. And we've been able to measure a real good response from that kind of approach. It's definitely time intensive. I spent 3 years talking to everybody, and I still do every quarter, every new employee and such. And then obviously the briefing updates as the world changes. So it's a lot of investment, but it definitely has a measurable impact, at least on the kinds of workers that we have.
Right, and I think with the industry you're serving too, right? I mean, like you said, that it's critical infrastructure, and critical infrastructure is highly regulated and heavily regulated, just like government contracts are at Raytheon, right? I mean, I would assume that you have rather an extensive cybersecurity requirement training for not just classified stuff, but for the unclassified.
Yeah, well, we really follow a lot of the same principles that were just described, right? We use the same training methodology. When it comes to specific missions we're providing, though, we have specialized training that we provide based on the outcomes that are desired for whatever that mission is. So it's more, instead of a cyber awareness, it's more mission-focused training is one of our goals. But I guess when it comes to, cyber training, the number one training that probably isn't given, there's like 2 things that are given. One is don't touch an electronic device before you've had your first cup of coffee. And that probably avoids half the phishing problems right there. At least in my household, it seems to do. And then the second one is there's no embarrassment when you are a cyber professional and you do make that mistake. Because that does happen, and it only gets worse. So part of the training for our teams as well is everybody's going to make a mistake. When you do something inadvertently, just say something immediately, and then we can start the resolution process.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I spoke to a large, the CISO of a very large bank of our nation. I won't say the name of the bank, but he said that it happened to him, and he was like, it was like slow motion. That he was like, son of a, and he was like moving towards the phone, and the phone rang, and picked it up, and he said, "We got it, don't worry," because he hit a button before coffee. So, and Neel, now you work with a bunch of different companies of sizes.
Yeah. So we deal with companies that are mid-enterprise, so less cyber rich than the large bank, and obviously large enterprises as well. I think one of the things is there's definitely a difference in the level of sophistication in terms of understanding cyber. So when you're talking about a big bank, they have the resources and the depth of experience. But when you talk about a mid-enterprise that's $1 million or $1 billion in revenue, they're a great target, but they're not as sophisticated. So one of the things that I heard someone say, and I feel like I'm an analogy guy, I think one of the things you have to think about as well is come up with an analogy that brings it home for someone that's not necessarily as sophisticated as a big bank. So I think that's point number one. The second point I'd say is examples that are your peers, right? So if someone in your industry group of your size, there's breaches in the news all the time, there's breaches that are being disclosed. Those are all learning moments, right? Look what happened to them over there. We do not want that happening to us. And as a leader of a company, so I'm also my company's internal CISO, I'm constantly sharing what's happening with our peers and what I hear from peer organizations on threats going on within their environment and making it real for them.
That's a great point, one we didn't really talk about yet, but I think all of you are in that position where, okay, so we've talked about the employees. How do we get the rank and file educated? How about the CISOs? How do your peers remain up to snuff with things that are changing on the daily? Are there particular areas, or recognizing it's going to be industry specific, recognizing it's going to be data specific, but are there things that you do that you would recommend that people look at? And this is pop fly, whoever wants to catch it. But are there things like that you would recommend or that people look for, towards, join? Whether it be the InfraGard, whether it be the Electronic Crimes Task Force. Are there what types of resources are out there for CISOs and people to learn and get educated on?
Yes. So I'll start.
Yeah.
I think number one is talking to your own peers, like whether large company, small company, but folks in that role. Every CISO I've talked to, they say they've learned the most from these intimate breakfast type settings, or they're at a conference and they have some sort of session for CISOs of different industries, different sizes, all get together and talk. So I think that's crucial, I think, to really get a pulse for what's going on. And then there's myriad news sources. So I think that, there's ones I read that I'm sure there's others in this room that read others. And so find the ones that you find most informative, again, based on your level of sophistication and based on where your risks are within your business. So those are some of the things I think work really well.
Do you guys have any other suggestions or places that you look?
Those are great.
Yeah.
I'd say absolutely do those. Relationships matter in cybersecurity. And so I think building the relationships with your key vendors, right? Your Accentures, your Mandiants, your CrowdStrikes, all those kinds of companies are putting out products as well that can add to the collaboration side of the house, but also relationships with your government partners. When I get those calls the Thursday night and I'm looking going, oh, great, this is such and such an agency, and that means it's not good, but that's okay. I mean, if I'd rather hear about it from them sooner than later and be able to react to it and work on it. And so they don't have an obligation necessarily to call you at home at 7:00 at night. So if you build a relationship and you're willing to give and take, you're willing to put information into the big machine, you're going to get something out of the big machine. And so I think investing in the relationships to build those information conduits, I think, is an important tool.
Excellent.
So I don't want to add on to what they already said. I think that makes sense. I think the one thing that I would say is, as a CISO, don't make an assumption that the executives you work with at your company hear the same news that you do the same research that you do. So you may be informed, you may be talking to all the other CISOs, your COO probably isn't, CEO probably isn't. So there is an element of make sure that you are taking advantage of that and using the information that you have to keep others informed in what's deemed as appropriate or works within your setting. But don't make an assumption that other leaders of the company have learned and heard the same things you have.
That's a good point. That's going to get us into our next piece. Good segue, because it's one thing to know what's going on. It's one thing to shuffle it down to employees. How do you educate up? And I think educating up becomes very, very challenging. All of you have worked for large companies or with large companies, and as many of you are in the audience, recognize you just maybe don't have time for this right? It's like, I got so much crap to do. You want to talk to me about what? So how do you educate up? And I know that there's a couple things here that we're talking about, is getting information in a usable format, right, to the people that can make a decision. How do you do that? I think that's probably a common trend. And for those of you that are leadership, maybe this is an opportunity to say, how do I listen, right? How do I listen down? Because there is a change in the dynamic because of what the SEC is doing and what's being expected of CISOs. But so with that, how do you do that? How do you speak up? And then how do you communicate it in such a way that a person may understand it that might not be talking to the same people?
I think you need to have your forums. If you're trying to create something one-off, it makes it really hard and challenging for it to be effective. So whether you have a concept of a steering committee with key leaders that you have worked with to make sure that they're a partner with you in terms of cybersecurity, if it's tabletop sessions with leaders that play a role in incident management, it could be formal communications. But to me, you have to have a vehicle. You have to have a place for communications. If you don't have that place, I think that's something to work on. But when you do communicate and when you share, you have to connect it to the business. That's when it resonates. Connect it to the business in terms of this breach happened externally, to Neel's point, what does that mean for us? Connected to the business in terms of here's new SEC rulings, here's what we do as a business, here's what it means for us. I think that's really, really important. If you just take something as pure cyber news, often it doesn't resonate, but you still have to have a communication vehicle and process with people that expect to get something from you. Then you start to have a really nice kind of relationship between your leaders expecting something from you, what you provide. And I think fundamentally that matters. Otherwise, it feels very one-off and ad hoc, which oftentimes doesn't feel like you can really build upon when you talk about communications with executives. Trust, consistency, and communications is important. So at least have a standard process for how you would communicate up.
Definitely agree with that. I think trust is the big one, right? I think if you don't have trust up, you're not going to be able to communicate. But for me, the important stepping stone for trust up the chain is a trust with your peers. If you're going up and the CIO doesn't know, if you're going up and your key business partners don't know and they don't believe in you and they don't have alignment with that, then they're likely to balk at that.
Yeah,
that can't happen here.
Yeah.
Well, now you've created churn and noise for the senior leaders where it looks like the CIO is fighting with the CISO, et cetera. That's not good, right? So I always go horizontal before I go vertical. And then I always apply the Wall Street Journal test, right? If it's on the front page of that, the New York Times, et cetera, we better at least have talking points. You don't raise all those up the chain. They don't need to know everything. There's a cadence. There's a process to do that. But if they ask, you better be ready. And you better be ready with a thought-provoking response of here's the threat, here's the risk, here's what we've done about it, et cetera. So we're constantly prepping those, in essence, memos, right? And then when they ask, we're ready to go up. So a little bit of it, I think you alluded to it, is triage, right? Not bringing everything up the chain, being ready when it needs to go up the chain.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the keys is, right, the first time you're having a conversation with one of your employees is their performance review once a year. Right. Chances are that not going to be a very good conversation. So I think Lauren and Jon are exactly right. You have to have that continuous dialogue at the right place with the right people. But I think also one of the critical things is that's got to be risk-based. So when you're talking to the business leaders, whether it's somebody that runs a P&L or a business unit, or you're talking to the CEO, you have to put it in terms of what is our monetary risk? This system is going to be compromised. Does that cost us $1 million a day, or whatever the metrics are for your business? So really, is you got to turn it into a business risk-based communication strategy, which is hard if you're from the CISO. So you have to work with your peers in the business because they really understand what their business drivers are, what the deliverables they have to meet their customers, whatever products they're providing. I think that risk-based framework is critically important to communicating what are the important things to look at. When that phone call comes from you to the CEO at 7:00 at night, he understands it has violated one of those major risk factors you have in the business.
I corroborate all that. I'd say the business risk is the most important, but it's also knowing how to talk about that, right? A lot of CISOs I've met are like, well, we went from 1 million vulnerabilities down to 500,000 and, we got the end of life's out, and like the eyes glaze over. And so how do you effectively communicate and learn how to do that? We could say here, we all should talk in the context of business risk, but for a lot of CISOs, that's something that's a skill that needs to be learned. At least the ones I've been exposed to. The great ones are great at it. So that's the other thing, is just the language of business, being conversant in that. And the other point I would make is around, I think when you talk to someone at the board or C-level, is also looking at benchmarks, right? So what are, again, my peer organizations, my competitors, where are they at in terms of their maturity, and where are we at? And again, tying it to that business level language is going to be important. So that'll get the attention as well. If everyone's pretty hyper competitive, I think at the senior levels, and so that's another way to draw folks in as well.
I think that's a great point, because so often the words, the definitions, even in a regulated place like government contracts, they don't mean the same thing, or people don't use them the right way, right? They keep using that word. It does not mean what you think it means. But having the right lexicon and understanding who is saying what and why they're saying it, I think is imperative, because I see that all the time. There's a communication breakdown necessarily between those that are well versed in the tech versus those that aren't versed in the tech, or those that are in business that aren't in the business side. One thing that you all brought up is, and I think this is a good distinction, is the distinction between the CIO and the CISO. I see this a lot. I think it's a growing problem, at least in, I would say, medium-sized business. I think small, and we'll talk about this in a minute, small businesses don't necessarily have the luxury of having the positions for both. But in medium-sized businesses, especially in the regulated industry, I'm seeing it become more of a requirement necessarily to have a CIO and a CISO as, I would say, yin and yang, at the same level. I would love your opinions on that. What would a company that only has a CIO be foregoing, or a company that has a CIO that is atop of their CISO because it's all IT? What I would love to get your opinion on distinctions there, because I think there's huge distinctions, and especially in the environment that we're operating in now.
I think it was a Forbes article that said 85% of the filed 10Ks name a CISO independent of a CIO, just from this most recent filing on that.
Yeah.
I think the way my elevator speech is, the CISO is what you do for cyber, and the CIO is how you do it for cyber. So I might say we need two-factor authentication. He might say, I'm going to use Okta or whatever, RSA. I don't care. As long as you're achieving the goal, and then I measure against that goal, and we're aligned, and then that's good at the end of the day. And those are kind of the lanes we try to stay in. I think the subordinate relationship turns into IT is focused on delivering solutions, positive user experience, right? Recoverability, those kinds of things, which are very important things. Security can often be an impediment to that. So if they're not peer organizations with little yin and yang going on there, the what and the how, you can end up in a conflict of priorities.
And have you ever seen that? Have you seen where someone says where you are seeing butt heads or
natural tension? Always, I've seen big companies, especially where it's different groups. But even in smaller or mid-sized companies, I've seen it. That natural tension, in my opinion at least, is a healthy thing. But then there's what the outcome needs to be, and metrics around kind of that end-to-end process. Like the cyber team is responsible for detecting the bad stuff, but a lot of times the IT CIO organization has to remediate it. At the end of the day, that's an end-to-end process, and measurement of that is what's going to hopefully drive the alignment that's required. But I feel like categorically where there's two organizations, and they're either peers or one even reports into the other, it's that natural tension. But there's optimizing that needs to occur. Otherwise bad stuff happens, as everyone in this room knows. So
we've talked about the human side a little bit. Let's move over to the technology side. Sean was talking about earlier, and Tiffany were talking about about AI, the use of systems. Cyber resiliency is always the buzzword that we talk about. With a company the size, we'll start with Thomson Reuters of Thomson Reuters, that is just international in scope, so big, so many people, so dependent on information. How do you and how does Thomson Reuters address cyber resiliency? And how does it use its gadgets and gizmos aplenty to help it move forward?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. So one of the reasons why I love working in cyber is because every day isn't the same. So you kind of know that. It's like, you kind of get a thrill from like whatever's happening too. But it can make you nervous when you're responsible for an organization and you're balancing what is the external attacker going to do? What is the person within my company going to do? Is the employee that runs a critical process going to leave? So there's so many things that introduce change. And to your point, resiliency is so important. I think the key thing for me is what are your processes that you are dependent on to be managing when change happens? And looking at it from a maturity standpoint, not from a capability, not just can you do it, but you ask different questions. So if you have a 0-day vulnerability, if you went to whoever that team is responsible for it, and you didn't ask the question of, can you respond to this? You said, what's our process for responding to it? Have we followed the process before? Do you have data showing me that you can? Because if Joe or Sally is responsible and they're sick that week, and they're the only one. And you realize that while they had the capability to do it, they never wrote anything down. It wasn't based on process. It wasn't tied to maybe you have regulatory requirements that you need to meet. So when I think about cyber resiliency, it's not just about the tech. It's a lot about the people and how you approach it, so that I'm not worried if somebody's out of the office. I'm not necessarily, and by maturity, I also don't mean you have to be the most advanced person out there or capability or function either. But for those key things that you need to have resilience around, can you answer the questions? How would this work? Who else knows the process? And look at it for maturity, not just for a point in time heroics. Heroics don't give you resiliency. Heroics can be a point in time solution. So when I look at an organization and resiliency, it's everything from staffing to processes to how do I think things would happen on Christmas Eve. We all don't like the Christmas holiday timeframe in cybersecurity, but those are really, really important. And they're tactical questions where you can get a gut feel. And if you're not the CISO, then you can ask your CISO those questions too. So cyber resiliency for me is weathering any of those things that may come up, which is not about a person, not about a tech. It's about, do we actually know what we're doing? Would we be prepared? And what would those questions be that you would ask your team?
Agree with all that. I think at the Dominion side, we have a little bit of a different model in that if it makes or moves energy, so the stuff that matters to keep the lights on, isn't accessible to the world. We're our own telecom. We don't use Verizon. We don't use AT&T. We have our own fiber. We strung it ourselves through our own right-of-ways. So all the electrons stay inside. So the problem set gets a little different. It's a lot about recoverability, a lot about insider threat, right? How are you detecting it? How are you mitigating that? Because there are plenty of people that don't play for Team America. I mean, the best and brightest coming out of Virginia Tech are often foreign nationals that are here because their government sent them here. And
I'm a Hokie grad. I don't know how I feel about that. Go ahead.
I was waiting for that.
So am I.
Yeah.
But, and we're watching our Insider Threat program. The nexus shifts now, shifting from Tech to University of Tennessee and so on. But you can watch it happen where these folks are coming in. So resiliency is a lot around that. How do I get the right people with the right access that I'm monitoring it? I have full recoverability on the back end if something bad happens. I've got redundancy built into the system so that if they do something bad over here, it doesn't cause a cascading outage. All the same processes, plans, right? Documentation, training of people, awareness, all very, very important. But with the added wrinkle of you got to deal with those not playing for Team America as well.
Yeah, I think, Alex, we're all refusing to answer this as a technology problem. Yeah, because I've been the same way, right? It's ultimately people. Like Lauren mentioned, it's no coincidence that a lot of these things happen on Friday afternoon or holidays. Right? Our adversaries know that's when we're
Eastern Standard Time.
Yeah.
We're running at a degraded state. Mm-hmm. Right? There's people on that aren't paying attention, already gone for the weekend or going out for a holiday with their family. So ultimately, it's all about your team's preparedness, because that's what you're gonna rely on to have any level of cyber resiliency. Ultimately,
What I'd add is process for sure, and it's a muscle memory thing. I've seen clients that will say, "I'll do a pen test once in a while. Maybe I'll do an assessment, have someone come in and do that," and it's a one and done. And you got to practice your buckets every day if you want to be a great free throw shooter. And so doing things on a recurring basis, doing things where your organization builds that muscle, I call it the muscle memory when I talk to clients, is going to create that resilience, because the great sports teams, I'm a sports person, they haven't thought of every scenario, but they as a team know how to get around it. And since my daughter goes to UNC, that's the team I'm referring to. So, and then on the technology side, what I'd say is, I think Sean was mentioning this in the fire side. A lot of tools, a lot of data. What are those crucial things from a tech and data perspective that you need to figure out how to integrate, so that when that time comes where it's game time, it's the championship game, there's a breach that occurred, you're not scrambling for information, and the process kind of supports that. So I in my view, the integration of a lot of these tools that we see with our clients is another part of resilience, because otherwise you reduce the effectiveness of your response and how you remediate it. So I think there is a play from a tech perspective, but you can have obviously the greatest technology, and have a shitty process, and that's not going to help you in any situation.
Well, I think that brings up a good point too, because I suspect that a lot of people here maybe don't have the team that they need, right? That it's not going to be somebody, and it might not have to be somebody internal to the company, that there are managed service providers that are there to augment, right? So
that's my managed service provider. It's literally his team.
Yeah. So and recognizing we were talking about contracts and subcontractors, et cetera, in the government contract space. So how do you then utilize those managed service providers? What types of when you're having to, again, we were talking about trust, how do you then rely on your outside vendors to come in and assist when shit goes sideways? So how do you yell at him, or do you?
We have a nice big contract, a little too fat of a contract, but no, I think managed service providers are great. I think we've got a lot of government ones, NSA, you've got Homeland Security, you've got FBI, et cetera, all sort of active in the network at any given time, plus Raytheon, wherever they're soon to be called in a week, active in the network at the same time. I think part of it, though, is as you said, a lot of muscle memory there, a lot of repetition, right? I get a pen test every quarter out of Raytheon, but I get pen test every day out of internal folks, and I get pen test every month out of other entities. So I'm layering on a lot of different views of the process, simply because we all get biased in our view.
Right.
My internal guys look at it one way, Raytheon looks at it their way, and I want a lot of different views on it. I want that Swiss cheese so you can't get through my perimeter without somebody catching you.
Yeah. Now, and what about you as an MSP, or you providing services to other companies?
Well, it's us providing the service. I mean, a lot of times, quite frankly, we are brought in after there's something has happened, right, that's adverse, or a critical resource is left, and then the company no longer has the skills they require to run their systems, right, to actually understand what's going on and take action. So we have that whole part of the business where it really highlights the challenges in the industry around talent and trying to provide your own cybersecurity without relying on others. Sean on the fire side made that exact example. And that's what we see a lot is they can do it really well on their own for a long time, but when they lose a critical resource, all of a sudden the wheels fall off and they can't rely on that. So it's really a lot of times I think of us as the additional resources need to augment at any given time, depending on what happens with the company. And that's how we kind of approach our MSSP versus saying, okay, here's our stack of tools. You use these and we'll provide you an output. We really try to think of a much different approach as being an extension of their teams. When they need critical resources based on the breadth of services we provide, we can usually provide those.
Yeah, I agree with a kind of similar approach. I think there's also, when we talk to clients, it's about, where are your blind spots? And that's where we try. And again, if those blind spots are not places we play in, because we're a smaller firm, we know who to have them talk to, right? So we'll help quarterback it if need be. But if it's in our sweet spot, we'll offer up, everything from our expertise in varying different ways. So I don't want it to be a commercial for my firm, but the idea is you close those gaps, right? And if you have a sports analogy person, if you don't have a catcher where the ball's going, we'll help you. Let's find you the catcher. We know what is required, whether you're a mid-sized company or a Fortune 50 company, and let us work with you to help you figure out those gaps, whether it's a provider like a Raytheon that's got a much larger scale, or a very specialized skill, a niche skill that might be something that another company might be able to do. So I think it's knowing your client well enough to help them figure out where their blind spots are.
And Lauren, you were talking about if someone was out of the office, or how do you pivot? What is the best route if everybody's snowed in or out of the office, or for you all?
I think taking a step back, so it's not necessarily about TR specifically, but you have to do it ahead of time. If something happens and everybody's out, you're just going to have to figure it out, which if ultimately there needs to be to call an external party to come in, maybe you have an IR retainer in place, and based on resourcing needs or gap in data or severity of the issue, maybe you do need to call an external support, but it's really the stuff ahead of time. It's the making sure there's not that one person that does heroics. If there's one person that does heroics, it's probably a good thing to maybe go spend a bit of time on in the next week and say, how can I maybe have two people that are also heroic doing the same thing? But
single point of failure.
Yeah. And it applies to things not just about cyber. So I think, if you're talking about the point in time, you're going to have to figure out how to solve the problem. That's a bit different than preparedness. When I think about resiliency is about preparedness. When you're asking the question of at a point in time, if something like that happened, you're figuring out how to respond and solve a problem, which maybe you think about resiliency a bit different moving forward. So you don't have to do that next time.
Right. That's the whole rinse repeat methodology as well, like you were talking about. And when it comes to maturity, and I know that's something that a lot of my clients and a lot of the defense industry has been battling for the past decade, is this concept of cybersecurity maturity. It's kind of going to the wayside right now, but it'll always be present in at least a letter. But when it comes to how do you all address what I always call compliance in a box, right? Or all the new tools, technologies that are coming at you. I'm guessing daily that this will help this will do this. There'll always be those standard like RSA or Duo. There's always those big ones. But how do you address the wealth of new technology that is being approached to you to solve all your cybersecurity needs? How do you deal with it, I guess, and how do you vet it so that you're not making yourself less secure by adding something new that doesn't play well with the rest of your devices?
I think my answer is pretty simple. I don't look at technology to solve my cybersecurity problems. You have to know what your problems are first and then figure out how technology helps you. If you look at your technology stack or you go to RSA and you don't know what you're looking for, or someone calls you.
Get all the squeezy balls.
I get phone calls, constantly about a new tech. You got to know what your problems are. And then the technology conversations can maybe be a bit more relevant. So I would say that first. If someone comes and says, I need this new tech, understand what the problem was first. If you're a cybersecurity leader, don't get bogged down in it. There's a lot that's constantly coming at you, but know what your problems are, be grounded in those, and use technology as an enabler. Don't look to be technology as the sole solution.
Yeah, I think I try to keep up with some of the major technologies that are out there, but just like you said, I probably get 10 emails a day that I block vendors that I just don't need to talk to anymore because they're solving the best widget in the world. I tracked it for 6 months once, and at the end of the 6 months, out of the 300 some odd vendors I was tracking, only 40 still existed.
Wow.
Because they'd been bought out or gone under. And so part of it is just seeing who survives the churn of vendors out
the
there.
Fray.
But part of it is just asking that question, what's my problem and what do I need to solve it? Because a lot of cases, I already have the tools in-house and I don't want to overcomplicate the environment, right? Complexity breeds security risk. And so I can keep it simple. If Raytheon already does it for me, I don't need an alternate solution unless they're failing to achieve a goal. And then I need to look at the entire package.
And I'll just jump in. I think that's a good point too. Both of you guys said it, is that there is something to be said is it's not a cybersecurity risk. It's something else in there, right? It's multi-factor authentication. It's authorization. It's, authentication. There's something in there that is messing you up that other stuff isn't. So understanding that, it's like, how do we, if someone comes and says, I want a widget, why? For what? But is that what, are you seeing that as well and on a bigger scale?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would just say one of the other problems we see too, which is a little bit different, is the aversion to try that next thing that is desperately needed to fill a gap, because there's been an investment made. Right, you've gone to the board of directors and said, I need $1 million for this tool to solve this problem. Then 2 years later, you come back and say, I need $1 million, and all the board hears is I need another $1 million to solve the same problem I already thought you solved 2 years ago. So it becomes a reputational challenge as well for that individual CISO or whoever's going to the board to request funds to improve or evolve their enterprise based on the tools. I totally agree with Sean and Lauren, right? KMARI rules apply, right? You reduce the clutter in your life. You cannot have an environment that is overly complex. So, based on that, but you have to really also get past back to the point made earlier, the education stage of it's going to constantly evolve. I'm going to have to come back and spend the same money twice, it will appear, because things will have changed fundamentally. We will need to do something different. And that's a real challenge because there's obviously cascading effects from that. You get maybe hire new people, the whole new training plan for your staff. There's the integration that you may need to do. There's a lot of cascading effects from when you add something new to your environment that have to be considered as well.
The only, excuse me, the only thing I'd add is even smaller companies seem to struggle with like the too many tools, trying to like the shiny object syndrome, and so it's not limited to the big companies I've interacted with. The way I think about it is there's table stakes hygiene you need. Whether if you're a small company, that might be a crawl thing. It might be just go get, I'm making this up, just do multi-factor authentication and have a VM solution or something, right? It's something very simple. Whereas if you're very advanced and you've got a big target on your back because you're a big bank, you need to think about, again, what's the level of sophistication I need to protect my organization, couch that in risk, because you can't solve it for the entire environment, and then let that drive, because it's more the business risk, drive what solutions you have. And where you have a proliferation of solutions, prioritize rationalizing it based on where there's the most business risk. If you have your crown jewels and you have 1,000 different solutions pointed at it, you're not really protecting that crown jewel. So maybe that's an opportunity to figure out where to rationalize or integrate or do some automation. There's lots of ways to get around it. It's definitely a problem. We see it at our vantage point that it's already out there, it's already proliferated. So how do you kind of optimize that problem so that you're being smart about how you spend your dollars if you've already got a bunch of solutions out there? So.
Yeah, that's one thing that when we were talking and setting up the panel, one of the phrase you all used was cost fatigue. Mm-hmm. And it's something that I'm guessing a lot of people are experiencing. Some of you might be experiencing it as well. And recognizing that, and I think evolution, again, it goes back to what words are we going to use to properly address cybersecurity. It's not, we're going to fix it, right? We're evolving, we're maturing. How do you address cost fatigue in your system, or how do you see others doing it effectively? Because, like we were just talking about, 350,000 versus Chuck in IT doesn't work, right? I was envisioning the other day, going back to your sports analogy, it's the Kansas City Chiefs on defense. When you're thinking of cybersecurity, it's the Kansas City Chiefs on defense. You can have the best, and the entire NFL on the other side, right? The entire NFL. That, to me, that's what I think most companies are facing. Especially in regulated industries, especially in government contractors, if you're the Raytheons or the GDs or whatever, yes, you've got a great defense. But you know what you don't have? 350,000 people trying to move the ball the other way. So it's hard, I think, and I've seen it, where you tell the COO, generally the COO, it's not the CFO, it's not the CEO, it's always the COO, hey, listen, we need to do X, Y, and Z. We need to have our procedures. We need to have our postures change. We need to practice. And the question is, so is this going to fix it? No, it's not. Right? It's not. It gets us it helps us, but it doesn't fix it. How do you deal with that? How have you seen people effectively address this cost fatigue or the C-suite eye rolls of this again?
I think we've given you a lot of the tools already, right? I think we talked about the need to have trust, right? The need that not everything goes up as a cry wolf to the board. There's the ROI discussion right on the back end there about why does this matter? What is the business bottom line to this, right? A lot of times you can couch cybersecurity things as either a business risk or a business cost saver, or potentially even a business cost driver, a revenue driver, right, off that. So if you can put all those tools together and you have effective messaging, you are a CISO that can communicate that up, which is a more rare skill these days than it should be, that I think you can combat that to an extent. I think we're simply under the reality now of right now budgets are tightening. And so if you're not able to put that combined story together and you don't start from a position of trust and you are running up to senior leaders all the time, every time it's a Wall Street Journal article, you're going to lose that battle.
Yeah, I do think we've kind of highlighted a lot of the skills. The only other thing I would add is be efficient with the money you already have first before you ask for more. I don't think that's anything new or specific, but if you're going to go ask for more money, make it not the only conversation you've had with them about cyber all year. Use the skill sets we've already talked about and make sure that you are already being efficient with the funds that you have. So when you're asking for that net new, you're going to put it to work just like all of your other peers as business leaders are expected to do as well.
You got to get rid of all the vampire devices, right? All the things that are sucking the energy out of your electrical grid that are just sitting there in a.
No. Keep those. I want you to pay your bill.
Yeah.
Keep that.
Show them disgrace.
Off on that. But yeah, and that's the same thing with all the different tools and things you have, and all the service agreements and all those things. Are they really providing any value? Because those are all things that are taking away from your available funds to do the things that are critically important.
Yeah. The final point I bring up that's different, I agree with everything, is it's about the education as well. Like think about software engineering, right? If it's not like one day an application gets built on the IT side and that's the end of it. We're never going to spend money on that application or that back office application. Cybersecurity is the same way. The threats are constantly changing. Your environment is constantly changing. Again, I'm not saying like spend with reckless abandon, but it's prioritizing that spend and educating the board and such on the fact that it's a moving problem. It's a living problem that is part of making sure you keep your reputation, making sure your business operations are staying intact. It's not a one and done expense, but you have to demonstrate the very smart prioritization around what you're gonna spend and the ROI, like you said, against it. So I think that's part of the education around cybersecurity spend, in my view.
Yeah, working almost every presentation. The cybersecurity of today is not good enough for tomorrow. Right? You just got to prep in that battlefield that things will change.
Yeah, great. You just did an assessment. That's great. It's an hour later, and your environment has changed, and so have the bad guys. So same thing applies to like more major spend as it relates to cybersecurity. So I think those moving parts are part of that conversation with a board or C-level exec. And so again, that's the business language that I think that more folks that are more technical need to level up on.